Good afternoon. My name is Brad Trammell, and today I'm going to talk about 5 tasty tips for writing a delicious artist statement anyone can use. This isn't a bunch of theoretical nonsense. These are practical things you can do that'll make writing a statement easier so you can organize your thoughts about your work. Writing a statement is like giving your creative mind a deep clean. It's one of the best ways you can cut through all the bullshit and figure out what matters to you and what doesn't. There's a sense of clarity and purpose a good statement can provide. But the problem is, a lot of artists write statements in an effort to further mystify their work instead of just talking about what they're actually doing. This is why so many people walk away from reading or even writing statements knowing less than when they started. But it doesn't have to be this way. So in this report, I'll be making the case for why statement writing is good and then getting into my 5 tasty tips for writing your own. I think the biggest misconception people have about writing artist statements is that they're supposed to over-explain the meaning behind the work, that it's like a magician revealing how their trick works step by step, thereby ruining the magic. Artists tend to have an antagonistic relationship with writing statements because they feel like they're being forced to give their secrets away. This is why so many artists write in a way that further mystifies their work, because they're compensating for the fear of having to get naked. But like I said, artist statements don't have to be that way if you have a positive conception of what they are. So let's start over. An artist statement isn't meant to be a waterboarded admission of your work's meaning. It's a chance for you to give a viewer the tools for them to discover that meaning on their own. A good statement is the opposite of mystification. Think of it like this. Because making art is typically a solitary act, every artist is prone to building up an elaborate web of references and materials that over time only becomes understandable to the artist alone. Artists have a tendency of developing a kind of personal hermeneutic in their work. It's a mode of interpretation specific to them that only they can use to understand themselves. The job of an artist statement is to teach someone else the language you speak to yourself so that you and the viewer have a better chance of communicating. This is why artist statements are as much about a viewer understanding your work as they are about you understanding your own work. There's this idea that statements are always a concession you have to make to help other people out, but the truth is they're actually more selfish than that. The clarity you develop from statement writing teaches you how to speak your own artistic language, so you can take inventory of what things are worth repeating and what parts you want to change. So while statements might be useful to a viewer who happens to read them, they are guaranteed to be useful to the artist who writes them. That's why it doesn't fucking matter if you want to show your statement to the world or just keep it private. It's useful either way. And here's one last thought about why I think statements are a positive thing. People always talk about how artists stop making work in their 20s because they start a different job or they aren't making sales. But one thing people don't talk about is that a lot of artists just become bored with their own work and stop making it. And the fastest way to become indifferent to your own art is to not understand what you're doing or why. I can't think of a single artist I know who quit because they got bored knowing exactly what they wanted to make all the time. So what I've done is come up with 5 tasty tips for writing a delicious statement. This isn't a step-by-step guide because I don't think there's a linear path you need to take, but I hope these can be helpful in crafting your own recipe. Number 1, you just gotta do it because no one's gonna ask you to write one. I remember when I was making art for commercial galleries, I had a studio practice and there were 2 different types of cleaning we'd do. There were the purely maintenance cleaning jobs, like throwing scraps in the garbage or vacuuming sawdust, basically the stuff you have to do so you don't trip over anything when you're walking around the next day. And then there were the annual deep cleans, where we took everything off the shelves, determined what supplies we needed, repainted the walls white. It was, admittedly, a pain in the ass, and it never seemed like there was a convenient time to do it, no matter how much it needed to be done. The casual conversations you have with your friends about your work at a bar, those are the maintenance cleans for your artistic practice, because they do just enough to update and articulate your thoughts for that situation. Writing an artist statement is the deep clean. It's the pain in the ass organizational overhaul that always ends up making you feel better once you're done. As my buddy Jordan Peterson would say, you gotta clean your mental studio, bucko. Because if you don't arbitrarily commit yourself to a mental organization process every once in a while, then all those little thoughts, materials, and experiments you've done over the past year or more, they're just going to keep building up in cluttered piles in your brain. And as those piles build up, you're prone to forgetting about all the things that truly excited you about your work because they're going to become buried under whatever you've done most recently. So, no matter how arbitrary or difficult it seems, the only person who can force you to undergo this process is you, because no one's ever going to ask you to do it for yourself. Number 2, you need to write in your own voice. There can't be a separation between the way you naturally communicate and the way you write your artist statement, because the medium is the message, style is substance. All the idiosyncrasies in your speech, the phrasing that comes most natural to you, the temperament that comes through in your voice, these are some of the most effective ways you can help a viewer learn to speak your artistic language. Have you ever just met an artist in person and automatically been like, oh my God, it's all coming together. Their work makes so much more sense to me now. That's why you have to write in your own voice. There's meaning in the way you communicate just as much as the broader content of what it is you're writing. This is why the default setting of artists universally relying on International Art English has rendered the artist statements written through it useless. The pressure of communicating using this nonsense pseudo-academic language has turned off countless viewers from looking at art and even more artists from creating it. If you've never been told this before, please allow me to be the first. You don't need to write your artist statement in International Art English, and you shouldn't write your artist statement in International Art English. You should write your statement however you naturally communicate. Now, obviously, a prepared statement is going to be a slightly more articulate version of the way you talk than if you were just riffing in a bar. That's fine. The enemy isn't articulation. That's the goal. The enemy is obfuscation. It means avoiding all the unnecessary layers of jargon and pretense that make what you're saying more difficult to understand. This is why the easiest way to edit your statement is just to read it out loud. If you're reading it out loud and think, this sounds like an articulate version of the way I'd normally talk, great. But if you're reading a sentence out loud and you think, this sounds like someone else is speaking, then you got to go back and revise. A good statement is basically a script you can use later on in studio visits or in dialogue with yourself when you're thinking about what to make next. If it doesn't come naturally to say, then it's not going to come naturally to think, so your statement has to feel natural to read in order for it to be useful. Number 3, write incrementally. Focus on how and what before getting to why. One way to think about writing artist statements is to consider the relationship between your output and your intent, how the work is made and why the work is made. But the problem is, a lot of artists actively avoid thinking of who their audience is or why they even make art in the first place. And I'll admit, this is a fairly difficult existential question, but it's a question worth confronting at some point because knowing the answer to why you make art is the most effective way to give your work purpose, the kind of purpose that can sustain your practice even when money isn't pouring in or when a shitty job is distracting you from it. I think a lot of artists probably just haven't asked why they do what they do in a little while, which is perfectly fine. If you thought about it every single second, it would probably drive you crazy. So instead of diving into answering why, I recommend inching towards it by first asking how your work is made and what it is you're making. Because when you write out your entire process from start to finish, when you list all the materials you use, when you listen to yourself describe everything depicted through your work, all the references, all the influences, when you take all of this into written account, the totality of the specific decisions you've made will likely reveal your work's purpose to you. All of these decisions you've made can't just be random. There's a thread that unites them. There's a pattern in the hows and whats. It's a way of asking, why else would I be doing all of these specific things if I didn't have this intent, this audience, this purpose in mind? Building a statement up by first writing in detail about how you make work and what work you make allows you to answer the question why you make art with deductive reasoning, so you don't have to figure it all out from scratch. Number 4, Celebrate your influences. It is the most bizarre deflection that artists will constantly hunt for some arcane block quote by an obscure poet or theorist from 100 years ago to use in their statement, instead of just mentioning the actual artist their work is made in response to. I mean, come on, we can all see the work. Hiding your real influences is a gesture of guilt, and it looks that way to the viewer. That work your influences made before you, it helped you figure out what you wanted to make. That was a gift that artist gave you. So instead of cowering away with your head down and reciting some obscure Germanic folktale under your breath in your statement, why not hold your head up high, gaze into your influences' eyes and say, hey, thank you, I appreciate it. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about creating a 100-person shout-out list at the end of your statement, but to be honest, that would be more refreshing to read than most of the purposely influence-avoidant statements I've seen. What I'm talking about is addressing the elephant in the room by celebrating your relationship with your influences so we know the similarities and differences that define you. There's no point in pretending your work exists outside of history because it'll inevitably be compared to other work by viewers, writers, curators, collectors, whoever. The difference is that when other people define your influences for you, they might not get it right. So this is your chance to take control of your narrative so someone else doesn't do it for you. And to be completely honest, what I'm telling you here is not good art market advice. The art market loves when you avoid celebrating your influences for the same reason they love when you fill up your statement with a bunch of incomprehensible nonsense. Have you ever noticed how all these commercial galleries are perfectly fine with releasing nonsense press releases show after show, year after year? If you've ever wondered why, it's because the nonsense is a feature, not a bug. It's because as an artist, they want you to be a hollow vessel. They want you to be an ill-defined piece of Laffy Taffy that curators can bend around whatever vague group show is most advantageous to their programming. They want you to be everything to everyone, so that when dealers are explaining your work to collectors, there's no barrier to entry for their Xanax and white wine addled brains to understand what your work's about or who you are, because they can literally say it's about anything. Every bit of definition you can give yourself is a minor act of resistance against this process of anonymizing you into a bland, lifeless commodity. Celebrating your influences is not conducive to a marketing project built around vagueness, but it is healthy for the culture of art making, because if artists choose to hide the work they admire, then the celebration of art will always be left to nefarious middlemen who've never made art themselves. And we all know the type of work they like to celebrate when given the chance. Number 5, be honest with yourself about what you're making. There's a couple common hangups that make writing a statement pretty difficult, and the only way to get past them requires being honest with yourself. The first one is straightforward. If you don't make art, or if you don't make it on a regular basis, it's going to be tough to write an entire statement about something that doesn't exist. Artist statements aren't a form of wish fulfillment. You're not writing about what you'd like to make. That would be a proposal. You're writing about what you've actually done. So if you're writing and you realize, hey, wait a second, I'm talking about what I want to make in the future, then press pause on the statement and go make that work. That half-written statement wasn't a failure. It was the catalyst to help you realize what you actually wanted to do. The other roadblock people encounter, and trust me, I know plenty about this one from personal experience, is the difficulty of dressing up your commercial ambitions as being some kind of high-minded conceptual pursuit. Like I said, no artist exists in a vacuum outside of influence, and one of the biggest influences artists have is the pressure to figure out a way to make their work commercially viable. If you find yourself having difficulty coming up with an artistic explanation for why you've made something look a certain way, or why you fabricated it with this material, or why you're making monochrome paintings, there's a good chance that's because it might come from a commercial motivation. This process of pretending can be one of the saddest things about artist statements, not because it requires the artist to lie to their audience, but because it requires the artist to lie to themselves. This is the point in an artist's life where instead of confronting the realization that I make work this way because I believe it'll make it more likely to sell, they begin crafting an elaborate series of mental gymnastics to avoid ever thinking about what it is they're actually doing. Some artists go so far that they float away on a dissociative cloud, never to touch base with reality again. I think the biggest question when confronting how much sway commercial motivations have in your art is to ask, is this even working? Are the concessions I'm making to create art that looks like art that sells actually benefiting me in any way? Or are they just distancing me from my own work, from understanding what it is I do and why? Because if you're earning a living from it, I mean, okay, fine. That's the compromise you've made, and who am I to tell you how to pay your rent? But if you're making creative concessions for commercial viability and you're not even getting paid for it, then there's no reason to keep doing it. Artist statements don't have to be a way to put yourself in a concrete box of endless self-justification just to keep doing things you don't care about. If you're being honest with yourself, artist statements can be the perfect opportunity to choose a different path and start making whatever new work you want. All right, folks, that's all for now. I'm going to be doing an ongoing focus on writing artist statements with patrons at the Guaranteed Studio Visit tier. So if you want one-on-one help on getting a statement started, or with things like editing or structure, just want some feedback on your statement, hit me up and we can come up with a plan for writing a statement at your convenience. Bye-bye.